Every Roman legionary who ever marched into battle carried two completely different weapons designed to do two completely different jobs, and the order in which he used them, first one, then immediately switching to the other, was so deeply drilled into Roman military doctrine that historians still consider it one of the most important reasons Rome's armies kept winning against enemies who, on paper, often looked just as strong or stronger, which raises a genuinely interesting question, because most ancient armies built their entire identity around a single signature weapon, the Greek phalanx around its long spear, Gallic warriors around their long slashing swords, yet Rome deliberately built its infantry around a combination, a javelin meant to be thrown away almost immediately and a short sword meant for the brutal, close work that came right after. And understanding why Rome made that choice tells you almost everything about how the legion actually won its wars, and almost nothing about why it eventually stopped fighting that way at all. The first weapon was the pilum, and if you only glanced at it, you might mistake it for an ordinary javelin, the kind of throwing spear that had already existed in various forms across the ancient Mediterranean world for centuries before Rome ever picked one up, javelins used by Greek peltasts, by Egyptian soldiers even earlier than that. The basic idea of a pointed stick thrown at an enemy being about as old as organized warfare itself. But the pilum wasn't ordinary at all. It was a piece of specialized military engineering disguised as a simple stick with a point on the end, and interestingly, Rome didn't even invent it. The weapon's origins trace back to Gallic warriors, Rome's frequent enemies and occasional allies in the centuries before the empire. Archaeologists having found javelins with similar armor-piercing socketed points in Gallic graves dating back to the 4th century BC, meaning one of Rome's most iconic and effective weapons started life as something borrowed and refined from a people the Romans spent generations fighting, conquering, and, in typically Roman fashion, learning from in the process. A typical pilum measured somewhere around 2 meters in total length, with a wooden shaft attached to a long, surprisingly thin iron shank tipped with a small pyramidal point, and the whole thing was heavy, genuinely heavy, often around 2 kilograms or more, considerably heavier than most other throwing javelins used elsewhere in the ancient world at the time, which might seem like a design flaw until you understand exactly what that weight was for. The pilum wasn't primarily built to kill a man outright when it landed, though it certainly could. It was built to solve a much more specific tactical problem. How do you deal with an enemy who's hiding behind a big, sturdy shield? Here's the clever part. When a pilum struck a shield, its long, thin iron shank was specifically designed, through a combination of soft iron and clever construction, to bend on impact, sometimes deliberately at a weak point built into the design, sometimes simply because the metal itself was intentionally left less hardened than you'd expect for a weapon meant to survive multiple uses. Historians still debate exactly how much of this bending was a deliberate engineering choice versus a natural side effect of how the iron was worked, a debate that's continued in academic circles for well over a century now without any final resolution, since surviving archaeological examples show real variation in hardness and construction across different periods and manufacturing centers. But the practical result is not in dispute. Once a pilum punched through an enemy shield and bent, it became almost impossible to simply pull back out, and it definitely couldn't be thrown back at the Romans who just launched it. The enemy soldier standing there suddenly found himself holding a shield with a 2-meter length of bent iron and wood dangling awkwardly off the front of it, adding real weight and completely ruining the shield's balance, and his options in that moment were brutally limited. Either keep struggling to fight effectively behind a shield that had just become a genuine liability, or drop the shield entirely and expose himself. Right at the exact moment several thousand Roman soldiers were about to close the remaining distance with swords drawn. By the time we reach the late Republic and into the early Imperial period, Roman legionaries typically carried not one but 2 pila into battle, usually one somewhat lighter and one somewhat heavier, a refinement that gave them real tactical flexibility depending on how the enemy approached. The lighter pilum would often be thrown first, at a charging enemy from a distance of maybe 30 meters or less, while the heavier one could be held in reserve, either for a second volley if the enemy hadn't closed the distance yet, or, if things got desperate, even braced and used almost like a short spear in a defensive stance rather than thrown at all. A flexible fallback that meant the pilum was never entirely useless even in situations where throwing it simply wasn't the right tactical choice. This gave a Roman formation something most ancient infantry simply didn't have, a genuine ranged option built directly into standard infantry equipment, without needing to rely on separate specialist units of archers or slingers to soften up an enemy before the real fighting began. Though Rome did also use auxiliary archers and slingers extensively, the pilum meant that even the core heavy infantry itself, the citizen legionaries, had a built-in answer to the question of what to do before the two sides actually collided. The psychological effect of a coordinated pilum volley shouldn't be underestimated either. Imagine being part of an enemy force charging toward a Roman line, building momentum, shouting, committed to the charge, and then suddenly having to absorb a wall of heavy iron-tipped javelins arriving all at once, thrown by soldiers trained specifically to release their pila on command rather than individually whenever they personally felt ready. Men in the front ranks would fall or stumble, shields would suddenly become useless deadweight, and the tight formation an enemy needed to maintain in order to fight effectively would start to fracture in that critical half-second before actual contact, exactly when cohesion mattered most. There's a genuinely striking historical example of just how effective this could be. During the suppression of Boudicca's revolt in Britain in 60 or 61 AD, a Roman force of only around 10,000 legionaries reportedly used just 2 coordinated volleys of pila to halt the charge of a British rebel army that vastly outnumbered them, buying enough disruption and momentum for the Romans to then finish the fight with a decisive infantry advance, a battle Rome went on to win despite being wildly outnumbered by a force still furious over very real grievances against Roman rule in the province. The pilum saw action across the entire breadth of Rome's military history and geography, carried by legionaries fighting in the Dacian Wars in Eastern Europe in the early 2nd century AD, and centuries earlier at the grim siege of Masada in Judea in 72 AD, a piece of continuity running through hundreds of years and thousands of miles of Roman campaigning, the same basic weapon, refined and adjusted over generations, still doing fundamentally the same job of disrupting enemy shields right before contact, no matter which frontier of the empire it was being thrown on. Manufacturing a weapon like this at the scale Rome required was itself a genuine logistical achievement, since a single legion of around 5,000 men, each carrying 2 pila, meant state-run and state-contracted workshops needed to produce and maintain a supply of roughly 10,000 of these specialized javelins for just one legion, multiplied many times over across the dozens of legions Rome kept in the field. Across its various provinces at any given time, a scale of standardized weapons manufacturing that few other ancient societies attempted or achieved with comparable consistency. But the pilum was only ever the opening move, never the main event, because a thrown weapon, however clever, gets used up in seconds and then it's gone, still lodged uselessly in some Gallic or Carthaginian or British shield somewhere out on the field. Once both pila had been thrown, a Roman legionary's entire tactical identity shifted instantly to his second weapon, the one that actually did most of the killing in the brutal minutes that followed. The gladius, a short sword typically somewhere between 18 and 24 inches long, double-edged, and, crucially, designed almost entirely around thrusting rather than the wide slashing swings you might picture when you imagine ancient sword combat. The gladius itself wasn't a single unchanging design throughout Roman history either, and its evolution is its own small story worth pausing on. The earliest widely used version is generally called the gladius hispaniensis, the Spanish sword, adopted by Roman forces during their wars against Carthage on the Iberian Peninsula, where Roman soldiers reportedly encountered local Celtiberian blades effective enough that Rome essentially borrowed and standardized the design for its own legions. Another example, alongside the Gallic origins of the pilum, of Rome's willingness to adopt and refine good ideas from the very peoples it was fighting rather than stubbornly clinging only to its own earlier equipment. Later variants, which modern historians and collectors typically label the Mainz type and then the Pompey type based on where key archaeological examples were found, gradually shifted the blade's proportions, generally trending shorter and with straighter, less tapered edges over time, changes that most historians interpret as reflecting an even greater emphasis on quick, controlled thrusting in tight formation rather than any lingering use for wide cutting strokes. The name itself is worth pausing on too, since gladius simply meant sword in Latin, and it's the root of the word gladiator, meaning swordsman, a linguistic connection that ties the ordinary legionary's weapon of war directly to the professional fighters who entertained Roman crowds in the arena, two very different contexts for the same basic tool. This design choice tells you a huge amount about how differently Rome thought about infantry combat compared to many of its enemies. Gallic and Germanic warriors, for instance, often favored longer slashing swords, weapons that needed room to swing, that rewarded individual strength and reach, and that worked best when a warrior had enough personal space around him to really wind up and deliver a powerful cutting blow. The gladius assumed almost the exact opposite fighting environment. A tightly packed formation, shields locked together or nearly so, men standing shoulder to shoulder in a Roman line where there simply wasn't room for anyone to wind up a big dramatic swing without hitting the soldier standing right next to him. In that kind of crowded, disciplined formation, a short stabbing sword that could be drawn quickly, kept close to the body, and driven forward in quick, controlled thrusts into the narrow gaps between an enemy's shield and armor was simply far more practical and far more lethal than a longer weapon that needed open space to be effective. Roman training doctrine reinforced this relentlessly. Later Roman military writers, including the famous late antique author Vegetius, whose treatise on Roman military practice remained influential for centuries even after the Western Empire itself had fallen, specifically emphasized that soldiers should be trained to thrust rather than slash, on the reasoning, preserved in Vegetius's own writing, that a 2-inch thrust into a vital area was more likely to be fatal and left the attacker's own body far less exposed during the brief window of the strike than a wide cutting swing did, which required a much larger, slower, more committed motion that left a soldier momentarily vulnerable. Soldiers were drilled specifically to aim for the torso and throat rather than attempting showy strikes at limbs, and to use their large curved shield, the scutum, actively as an offensive tool as much as a defensive one, shoving into an enemy's own shield or body to create just enough of a gap, just enough separation for a fraction of a second, and then driving the gladius forward through that opening. It was efficient, almost mechanical in its brutality, closer in spirit to what one modern historian has bluntly called industrial-scale killing than to anything resembling individual heroic swordplay, and that's precisely the point. Rome wasn't trying to produce individual legendary warriors, it was trying to produce tens of thousands of interchangeable soldiers who could all execute the exact same simple, devastatingly effective motion in perfect coordination with the men beside them. The scutum itself deserves a moment of attention here too, because it wasn't just passive protection sitting on a soldier's arm while the real fighting happened with the other hand, it was an active, load-bearing part of the entire two-weapon system working alongside the pilum and gladius. Curved to wrap partially around the body, heavy enough at several kilograms to genuinely stagger an opponent when driven forward with body weight behind it, and topped in many versions with a metal boss, the umbo, hard enough to be used almost like a blunt punching weapon in its own right. The scutum meant a legionary in close combat was never purely defensive, even in the brief instance when his sword wasn't actively thrusting forward. A shove with a shield could knock an opponent off balance, force his own shield arm out wide and exposed, or simply by a half-second of disruption before the gladius followed through, meaning the so-called two weapons a Roman soldier carried were really operating as part of a broader three-part system, throwing weapon, shield, and sword, each supporting the others in a sequence practiced until it required no real thought at all. The sequence itself, pilum then gladius, wasn't something individual soldiers figured out on their own in the heat of battle, it was a doctrine, drilled into recruits so thoroughly during training that it became close to automatic even under the extreme stress and chaos of actual combat. Roman recruits reportedly trained for months against wooden posts driven into the ground before they were ever trusted with a real opponent, practicing the exact same thrusting motions over and over with wooden practice swords deliberately made heavier than the real gladius, so that the actual combat weapon would feel comparatively light and easy to handle by the time a soldier finally carried it into genuine battle. A training philosophy built entirely around repetition until the correct motion required essentially no conscious thought at all. This training regimen extended to marching as well, recruits drilled to cover set distances at a fixed pace while carrying full equipment, since an army that couldn't reliably arrive at the right place at the right time, in formation and ready to fight rather than strung out and exhausted along a road, could never actually put its carefully trained weapon sequence to use in the first place, a reminder that the pilum and gladius system only worked because it sat inside a much larger machine of discipline, logistics, and repetition covering nearly every aspect of a soldier's daily life in camp. A Roman formation would typically advance toward the enemy in careful, disciplined ranks, throw their pila at the optimal moment as the enemy closed the final stretch of distance, and then, almost without a break in momentum, draw their gladii and continue directly into contact, shield against shield, sword hand already in motion. This transition needed to happen fast and needed to happen uniformly across an entire line of soldiers simultaneously, because a formation where some men were still fumbling to draw their swords while others had already made contact with the enemy was a formation with dangerous gaps in it, and gaps in a shield wall were exactly where battles were lost. Once the front ranks made contact and the brutal work of close combat began, Roman tactical doctrine had an answer for the exhaustion that inevitably set in during sustained fighting too, something few of Rome's enemies could replicate. A system of rotation, where soldiers fighting in the front lines could fall back through gaps deliberately maintained in the ranks behind them, replaced by fresh troops who hadn't yet spent themselves in the fighting, while the tired men recovered further back, before potentially cycling forward again later in the same engagement. This kind of coordinated rotation under fire required exactly the sort of relentless drilling and internal discipline that turned individual soldiers into components of a single larger machine, since attempting anything this complicated without months of practice coordination would almost certainly produce chaos and gaps an enemy could exploit rather than the smooth, sustainable fighting rhythm Rome actually achieved. Very few of Rome's opponents across its entire military history managed anything comparable, most ancient battles being fundamentally a single prolonged clash where exhaustion simply accumulated on both sides until one line finally broke, while a Roman formation, in ideal circumstances, could theoretically keep feeding fresh, rested fighters into its front rank for far longer than an equivalent enemy force built around one continuous, unrotated engagement. What made this two-weapon system so much more than just a clever piece of individual equipment design was how completely it was built into the entire structure of how a Roman legion fought as a collective unit. The pilum volley was never meant to be a battle-winning weapon on its own, and the gladius was never meant to be used by an isolated individual dueling one-on-one in open space. They were doctrinally inseparable, each one setting up the conditions the other needed to actually be effective. The pilum degraded an enemy's defensive capability and disrupted his formation right before contact. The gladius then exploited exactly that disruption in the brutal, close-quarter seconds that followed, and neither weapon by itself would have made nearly as much difference as the two used together, in the correct sequence, by soldiers who drilled that exact sequence so many times it required almost no conscious thought under pressure. This is also part of why the story of Roman military success isn't really a story about superior individual weapons at all. However good the pilum and gladius genuinely were as pieces of design, it's fundamentally a story about system and standardization. When the Roman general and statesman Gaius Marius reformed the legions around the end of the 2nd century BC, facing a manpower crisis that forced Rome to open military service to citizens who didn't own property, a group previously excluded from the legions under the older, wealth-based system of recruitment, one of his most significant changes was making sure every single legionary, regardless of personal wealth or background, was equipped with essentially the same standardized weapons and armor, paid for and issued by the state rather than brought from home, a stark contrast to earlier Roman armies and to many of Rome's rivals, where wealthier soldiers might show up with better personal equipment while poorer conscripts made do with whatever they could afford or improvise. Once every man in the legion carried the same pilum, the same gladius, trained in the exact same sequence of throw, then thrust, Rome had effectively turned its infantry into something closer to a single coordinated machine than a collection of individual warriors, each replaceable, each trained to the same standard, each contributing to a tactical system that didn't depend on any one soldier being exceptionally skilled or exceptionally brave, just disciplined enough to do his specific, rehearsed job in exactly the right moment. Before Marius's reforms, older Roman armies had actually organized their heavier infantry armed with a longer thrusting spear called the osta, closer in spirit to a traditional Greek-style weapon, and it's worth remembering that the transition to a pilum and gladius-centered legion wasn't some instantaneous flash of genius handed down fully formed. It evolved gradually over generations of Roman warfare, first against fellow Italian peoples in the hills of the peninsula, then against Carthage, across multiple grueling wars, then against the Hellenistic successor kingdoms of Alexander's shattered empire in the eastern Mediterranean, with the Roman military system absorbing lessons, discarding what didn't work, and refining what did after nearly every major conflict it fought, a process of constant, almost restless adaptation that stands in real contrast to some of Rome's rivals, whose military systems, like the Macedonian phalanx, remained comparatively frozen in a form largely unchanged from generations earlier. You can see this combination doing exactly what it was designed to do across some of the most famous Roman engagements in history, and, just as tellingly, you can see what happened on the rare occasions it failed. At Pydna in 168 BC, a battle that effectively ended Macedonian independence and, by extension, the political legacy of Alexander the Great's successors, the famous Macedonian phalanx, that same rigid wall of extremely long spears called sarissas that had once conquered half the known world, proved devastating in the initial clash on open, level ground, but began to break apart and lose cohesion as the fighting shifted onto rougher terrain, and it was precisely in those broken gaps where the phalanx's long spears became unwieldy and its formation lost its terrifying uniformity, that Roman legionaries pressed forward with their short swords, exploiting exactly the kind of close, chaotic, gap-filled fighting that the gladius had been designed for and the sarissa had not. Even the catastrophic Roman defeat at Cannae in 216 BC, where Hannibal's brilliant double envelopment trapped and annihilated an enormous Roman army, doesn't really contradict this story so much as prove how completely tactical circumstances, in that case being surrounded on all sides with no room to maneuver at all, could override even the best-designed infantry weapon system in the world. A reminder that no combination of equipment, however clever, could fully substitute for sound generalship and favorable positioning. The pilum itself didn't remain unchanged forever either. By around 250 AD, It had gradually been replaced in general use by a related but somewhat shorter weapon called the spiculum, part of the broader evolution and adaptation of Roman military equipment across the later empire as the nature of Rome's enemies, its recruitment patterns, and its overall military strategy kept shifting in response to new threats along an increasingly stretched and pressured frontier. As the later Roman army came to rely far more heavily on cavalry and increasingly on infantry recruited from Germanic and other frontier peoples with their own established fighting traditions and weapon preferences, the strict, uniform doctrine of the classic pilum and gladius legion gradually loosened, longer swords becoming increasingly common again in the late empire. A slow reversal of exactly the specialization Marius had once standardized centuries earlier, as Rome's military identity itself shifted to meet a world that no longer resembled the one the original system had been built to dominate. The core idea, though, a heavy javelin meant to disrupt an enemy's shield right before infantry closed the final distance, persisted in one refined form or another for a remarkably long stretch of Roman military history. Evidence that the underlying tactical logic behind the original design remained sound even as the specific engineering details continued to be adjusted by generations of Roman military planners responding to new battlefield lessons. And that, more than the cleverness of the bending iron shank or the precise geometry of a stabbing sword blade on its own, was really Rome's genuine innovation. Other ancient cultures had javelins. Other ancient cultures had short swords. What almost none of them had was the combination of a doctrine specifying exactly when to use which weapon, drilled into ordinary citizen soldiers with such relentless consistency that an entire legion of thousands of men could execute the same two-stage attack in near-perfect unison, over and over again, campaign after campaign, against wildly different enemies on wildly different terrain. From the forests of Gaul to the deserts of Judea to the hills of Britain. The pilum bought a few critical seconds of chaos and disruption. The gladius turned that chaos into a decision. And the fact that every single Roman soldier carried both, and knew, without having to think about it, exactly which one to use and precisely when to switch, is a big part of why the legion kept winning long after so many of the individual enemies it faced had genuinely brave, genuinely skilled warriors of their own, who simply never fought as one coordinated system the way Rome had trained an entire army to do, a discipline built weapon by weapon, thrust by thrust, into the very design of the tools those soldiers carried into every single battle Rome ever fought, and one that, even after the specific weapons themselves eventually changed and faded from use, left behind a template for disciplined, standardized infantry combat that military thinkers would keep studying and drawing lessons from for the better part of 2,000 years afterward.